Welcome to Chapter 9. In this lesson, we're going to start relating tenths, hundredths, decimals, and fractions. So let's go ahead and we're going to take a look at some place values so we can identify what a tenth is and what a hundredth is. Just like when we were dealing with our fractions, our decimals are values that are less than 1. So they're located to the right of our ones place. So here we have some place values. We have our thousands place, then our comma, which ends the thousands period, our hundreds, tens, and ones. These are the values that we have been working with in the past. Then we see right here our decimal point. All values to the right of our decimal point are values that are less than 1 whole. So they're worth less than a whole. The first value that we have is called our tenths, and this is located the first place value to the right of our decimal, and then we have our hundredths, which is located in the second place to the right of our decimal. Those are the two place values that we're going to be working with in this chapter. So we have our tenths and our hundredths. Let's take a look at how those relate to our fractions of a tenth and a hundredth. So we're first going to look at tenths, and the tenths place is the first place value to the right of the decimal point. When we think about tenths, think about a dime. A dime is worth 10 cents. 10 dimes make up $1. So 1/10 of $1 is what 1 dime is equal to. 10 tenths or 10 dimes make up 1 whole dollar or 1 whole. When we're dealing with our decimals and our fractions, we want to identify how they are equivalent, how they're equal. So the first one we're going to look at is 2 tenths, and we recognize this as our fraction 2 tenths because it has the 10 in the denominator. When we're rewriting this as a decimal, we want to notice that there's nothing right now in our ones place. There's nothing that holds that value, so we're going to place a 0 in our ones place, and then we need to place our decimal, and then our 2 is going to end up in our tenths place, which is that first place after our decimal. Same as if we're looking at 5 tenths. So we would rewrite 5 tenths as a 0 in our ones place because there's no whole number, and then a 5 in our tenths place. And that's it. Those 2 tenths, and we also read this as 2 tenths because that's the place value it's in. Those two are equivalent. Our fraction and our decimal are equivalent. Now if we see a decimal first and we want to place that decimal into a fraction, we need to identify where that number is located. So this 6 is located in our tenths place, which means we have 6 tenths. This 9 is also located in our tenths place, which means we have 9 tenths. Now let's say we're dealing with a mixed number, which means we have a whole number and a fraction. This whole number is going to go in our ones place because it's worth a value of 1 whole, and then we're going to have 7 tenths. So it would look like 1, and then our decimal, and then our 7 goes in the tenths place. And that's it, 1 and 7 tenths. And when we see that decimal, we read that as and. So 1 and 7 tenths, just like if we're reading our mixed number, we have 1 and 7 tenths as a mixed number. When we see it in our fraction form, or in our decimal form as well, again, here is our decimal, so we read that as and we're going to write this as 3 wholes, and our 2 right here is located in the tenths place, so we would rewrite that as 2 tenths. So that's how our decimals and our fractions are related for tenths. I want you to go ahead and give some of these a try. If you see a fraction, I want you to turn it to a decimal, and if you see a decimal, I want you to turn it to a fraction. Let's go ahead and start with 4 tenths. 4 tenths would look like 0.4, or 4 tenths would be how we would read it, and our 4 is in the tenths place. The next one I want you to do is 7 tenths as a fraction and turn that into a decimal. 7 tenths as a fraction, we would have our 0, we would have our decimal, and our 7 would end up in the tenths place. Again, that's the first place after the decimal. And then we have 8 tenths as a decimal, and again, this 8 is in the tenths place. So when we rewrite that as a fraction, we have 8 tenths. Now the ones on the bottom are mixed numbers, and so we need to make sure that the whole number ends up in the ones place, and then we have our decimal. So instead of a 0 in our ones place, make sure that whole number ends up in your ones place. We would rewrite this one as 3 and 9 tenths. go ahead and try the next one. We would rewrite this as 5 and 6/10. And give that last one a try. This one needs to be turned into a mixed number. The 2 is in the tenths place, so we would rewrite this as 6 and 2/10. Okay, that's our tenths and our decimals. Cody has a rock collection. 4/10 of his rocks are igneous rocks. What is this amount written as a decimal? 4/10 of his rocks are igneous rocks. What is this amount written as a decimal? Go ahead and solve this. I need to take 4/10 and I need to turn that into a decimal. So I would have 4/10. That's how much of Cody's rock collection are igneous rocks. All right, now the next thing we're going to look at is our hundredths and turning our hundredths into decimals, or our decimals that are worth hundredths and turning those into fractions. Now when we read these very similar to how we read our tenths. The hundredths place is the second place to the right of the decimal. When you think about hundredths, think about pennies. So 100 pennies make up $1. 100 hundredths make up 1 whole. Notice our denominator is 100, so that helps us as well. Now, when we're turning these hundredths into decimals, the process is very similar to what we did with our tenths. Because we don't have anything in our ones place, we're going to place a 0, we're going to place our decimal, and then we would write 31. Now we read this as 31 hundredths because we read the last place value of the decimal. So 31 hundredths because that 1 is located in the hundredths place. Our next one is 49 hundredths, so I would rewrite that as 49 hundredths. And again, we read it as 49 hundredths because that 9 is located in the hundredths place. Now here's where it gets tricky with hundredths. This 9 hundredths, notice how it doesn't have a 2-digit number. It's just a 1-digit number. And this 9 needs to end up in our hundredths place. So when we're writing a single digit over 100, we need to make sure that that single digit ends up in the hundredths place. So we have our ones place, we have our decimal, we have our tenths place, and we don't have anything in our tenths place here, and then we have our hundredths place. So when we rewrite this one, we need to make sure that our 9 ends up in our hundredths place, which is where it ends up right here. Now the last one on the bottom here, when we are turning a mixed number into a decimal, again, it's very similar to what we just did. This 3 ends up in our ones place, and then we have our decimal, and then we have 12 hundredths. When we're turning a decimal into a fraction, we need to identify what place value we're turning it into. So because we have 21 hundredths here, this is going to be 21 hundredths. And then for the next one, notice how this 7 is in the hundredths place, but there's nothing in the tenths place. So when we're turning this into our mixed number, we have 5 and 7 hundredths. Okay, go ahead and give these next few a try. 27 hundredths, turn that into a decimal. Our decimal would look like this. 27 hundredths. How about 3 and 91 hundredths? Turn that into a decimal. We would have 3 and 91 hundredths. 53 hundredths, turn that into a fraction. We'd have 53 hundredths. 59 hundredths, turn that into a decimal. We don't have anything in our ones place, so we'd place our 0, and then we have 59 hundredths. 1 and 5 hundredths. We would have 1 and 5 hundredths. My 5 needs to be in our hundredths place. Think of this like 5 cents. So our 5 would be in our hundredths place. And then the last one, 7 and 42 hundredths. We'd have 7 and 42 hundredths. Let's go ahead and take a look at one final word problem, and then that's all for our lesson today. A mosaic table has 100 of the same size pieces. 38 of the pieces are red. What part of the mosaic tiles are red? What part of the whole is red? Write it as a fraction and as a decimal. When we're writing this as a fraction, our whole is 100 and our part that's red is 38, so we would write it as 38 hundredths. If we're writing this as a decimal, we would have 0 wholes and we would have 38 hundredths. All right, that's our lesson for today. We were talking about hundredths of fractions and decimals, and then tenths of fractions and decimals. Remember where your tenths place and your hundredths place are located on our place value chart. The tenths is the first place value after the decimal, and the hundredths is the second place value after the decimal. See you tomorrow.